Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Intro to Reserve Studies. This webinar is sponsored by Association Reserves. My name is Paige Sharman and I'm the National Marketing Manager for Association Reserves, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today. Intro to Reserve Studies is a 45-minute webinar designed to help you better understand your role in guiding your association toward a stable and successful future. Getting there requires a clear grasp on the financial challenges facing each board and community and an accurate understanding of what a reserve study is, what it includes, and how to use it effectively. In this session, we'll break down the core issues. No frills, no complicated math, just a straightforward explanation of what you need to know to make smart, future-focused decisions at your association. Your success hinges on setting aside the right amount of money to properly maintain your property, and we're here to help you get that right. Reserve funding decisions are among the most important financial decisions a board makes. These choices impact your community for years, so avoiding costly mistakes like deferred maintenance, special assessments, or safety risks is crucial. Due to the number of participants today, everyone has been muted, but you can submit questions anytime by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. Not the chat box, but the Q&A box. We will be answering as many questions as possible during the final 10 minutes of the webinar. This webinar has been approved by the Community Association Managers International Certification Board, CAMICB, for 1 CE credit toward the CMCA certification. I'll be emailing certificates of completion within 1 week. Just a reminder, the credentialing committee does monitor attendance duration, so make sure you're with us for the full webinar. Our hosts today are Sean Kargari and Sean Andersen, both reserve specialists and office presidents with Association Reserves. Sean Kargari is the president of Association Reserves Los Angeles office, also serving Central Coast, Hawaii, and Nevada. He has prepared reserve studies for a wide range of properties, including condominiums, high-rises, luxury resorts, schools, and public facilities across the United States and internationally. Sean brings broad industry experience and strategic insight to helping communities plan responsibly for the future. Sean Andersen is the president of Association Reserves Orange County, Inland Empire, and Coachella Valley office. Sean has worked with hundreds of community associations. He is recognized for his straightforward communication style and his ability to translate reserve study data into practical board-level decision-making guidance. Sean focuses on helping associations build strong, sustainable funding plans. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sean Kargari.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much, Paige. Sean and I, both Seans, are very happy to be hosting you today. As Paige mentioned, that this course we're going to cover a wide range of reserve study basics, whether you're new to the board or a new property manager, or have been working with reserve studies for many years, but are still a little uncertain about how or why we do certain things or how we come to certain conclusions. Either way, this course is for you. We hope that you come away with a much better understanding so that you can better absorb your reserve study products and share the info with the membership at large. Next slide, please. So, the practical definition of your reserve funds, it's very simple. Money that an association sets aside to offset the ongoing deterioration over long periods of time for large repair and replacement projects. So, you have many moving parts of your community, a lot of expenses. You have a lot of non-reserve expenses, the operating side of the budget, monthly, annual bills, which are very predictable. But then you have much larger expenses that happen every few years or every decade or longer. So, how can you possibly plan for those irregular expenses? And that's the whole point of reserves is to uh, basically figure out how do we contain all these wild expense swings that are coming from your reserve side into a stable contribution, a reserve transfer that can fit into a budget, and so you can proceed with confidence moving forward.
Yeah, and one of the things I like to jump in here is, or I like to add here, is that for us, for our board members who are on the call with us, remember that What it doesn't say here is that this is a savings account. We don't want to get into the mindset of it being a savings account because if we get in the mindset of it's a savings account, we won't spend it. This money is being taken from our ownership and being sent into this pool of funds so that it can be spent. We don't want to get in the mindset of it's a savings account because it's literally there to be spent. So we want to make sure that we're collecting it as the components deteriorate and then we spend it as they fail.
Exactly. So, as I mentioned, the operating funds. This is going to cover the routine costs. Think of your monthly utilities, your annual insurance premiums, your pool service. These are very much in the forefront. They often take up a lot of attention of the board and management because they're on a regular basis. They tend to be much easier to predict as far as your costs and formulating a realistic budget for your operating funds is extremely important. But there's a separate account, as most of you already know, probably, which is the reserve funds, and these are those irregular costs. It does have restricted use. The money you allocate towards the reserve funds. It's not just like, as Sean said, a rainy day fund. So you should not be pulling from reserves to cover unexpected operating funds. These are allocated to your large scale projects. We have when Sean and I are looking at reserve funding plan forecasts, we will see future annual expenses for any given community, and that can swing from $10,000, in any given year to $1 million the very next year. So the whole point of the reserve study is to be able to absorb these wild price swings with a stable transfer. And your common area assets are tend to be extremely expensive. We're talking about roofing, painting, asphalt, elevators, and many, many more. So we can capture all these projects and kind of package them to fit nicely within your annual budget as one line item that will capture all these future expenses moving forward. So, what is a reserve study? As many of you probably already know, it's a budgeting planning tool which identifies not only your future common area uh, assets, your component lists, but the current status of your reserve fund. And the goal is to provide a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the future major common area expenses. And by equitable, we mean by, over the useful life of all of your projects, we aim to spread the costs equally over that useful life. Um,
Yeah, and I was going to say, Sean, in layman's terms, so what it basically is going to tell us when it tells us the current status of the reserve fund, that's our percent funded, right? And then the
exactly.
current equitable contribution rate is going to be the monthly or annual reserve allocation. And so that's it. So that is the nuts and bolts of what a reserve study is and what it does.
Exactly. It's people always ask, and we'll get into a lot more details on what we're referring to, percent funded, fully funded balance, and the funding plan in general. But it provides a really quick snapshot on the health of your reserves and um, basically like a wellness check on your community if you're going to be able to cover expenses or not. You're going to come across a lot of industry terminology that, if you were never involved with a community association, you're not going to be familiar with. We understand that, and this causes a lot of confusion. So, there's three primary levels of a reserve study. Level one is the full reserve study, full site visit, also commonly referred to as. This is usually for a first time reserve study, a new community, or a community that's never had a reserve study in the past, or you're looking to switch companies, reserve study providers. But we're going to quantify all of your common areas either by taking measurements or taking the counts of all your light fixtures, for example. This is where we build the reserve component list for the first time. The level one establishes this component list, and the benefit is moving forward, this will allow you to opt for cheaper levels of service because we can update that initial component list moving forward. So a level 2 reserve study is a with site visit update. Usually every 3 to 5 years nationally. In the state of California specifically, it's required at least every 3 years, where we'll revisit the property, take a look at all the physical conditions, reevaluate all of your components and assumptions. But we're not going to remeasure, recount most things. In between the 3 year site inspections, you can opt for a level 3 update no site visit, where we take the established component list and we'll update it based on your current financials and the status of your projects, as well as current inflation rates, and update your costs accordingly.
So, Sean, just to clarify, you do not need a full reserve study every 3 years to keep compliant with the Davis Sterling Act, right?
Correct. And that causes a lot of confusion. It's probably, our fault as reserve study providers. We'll get asked, are you going to do a full inspection of the property? And yes, of course, we're going to do a full inspection of all of your common areas, but it's not a full reserve study
Right.
necessarily.
Yeah. If I've already measured your roofs, I don't need to remeasure them. Just pay me to do a level 2 at this point, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So when
So
should we start?
sooner the better. It sounds like it would be early at this point for all you January 1st fiscal year starts, but actually at the moment it is ideal to start your reserve study update process, because we encourage clients to start it 7 to 8 months before the start of the fiscal year. The primary reason is the turnaround times. Typically, a reserve study has an 8 week turnaround. So if we start that clock today, we're looking at a late July delivery of your reserve study draft. And ideally, the board should spend at least a board meeting together scrutinizing the reserve study. So if you get the draft in late July, your next board meeting is scheduled mid-August. You want to have time to review it. If there are revisions that are necessary, or you have some important questions about the reserve study assumptions, you can then provide that, go back to your reserve specialist. Ideally, you want to have your reserve study finalized at least a month before your annual budget meeting. And so for all you January 1st fiscal year starts, I know that most of your annual budget meetings are every September or October. So that's why we're already into the get moving zone, because you guys do not want to wait too long and then have the reserve study come in right before the meeting, especially after the meeting. You want to use it going into that meeting as your budgeting guide for your new reserve budget for the upcoming fiscal year.
Yeah, and that'll give us time to get the budget approved and get the disclosure sent out in November. And that way we're totally compliant with civil code at that point, right?
Exactly, exactly. We get some clients calling us the week of Thanksgiving in a panic, trying to get the reserve study update so they can get that reserve disclosure for their budget packet. You want to avoid that. You're not getting the most value out of your reserve study. You need time to review it with your reserve specialist together to get a better understanding. So your reserve study is going to be built primarily on two parts: the physical analysis, which is our site inspection, and the financial analysis. And we derive the physical analysis in person. If it's a full, as you can see here, with our friend Will in Florida with his measuring wheel, we're taking measurements of all the common area assets, square footages or the length of the fencing. Robert and Jim, left and right, if things need to be counted, we'll count those up, but also the physical evaluation. Robert's taking a knee on basically an asphalt pothole right there. So, regardless, it's not, we get questioned all the time, is it just, updating a spreadsheet with useful lives and industry standards? And for a large part of it's no, it's based on an actual physical analysis. So if this community, with Robert taking the photo of the asphalt there to the left, if they repaved their asphalt 5 years ago, and that's what it looks like today, we're going to drastically reduce the remaining life based on those current conditions. So that's why it's extremely important to get eyes on your common areas every 3 years, because regardless of project history, it's also based on current conditions.
Yeah, I really think the third year is kind of the sweet spot. I'm glad the state of California used that as the benchmark because I think 3 years kind of shows if things are prematurely deteriorating or not. If you push it out 5 years, it doesn't it's too long. And then every year is too much. You don't need a site visit every year, stuff like that. So I think 3 years is really kind of a sweet spot there.
Exactly. And based on the foundation of your reserve component list, then we can actually obtain the real data to determine, the funding plan moving forward. And that's the financial analysis. We're going to map out your projects over the next 30 years. All reserve studies in California are going to have a 30-year projection. And this is how we're going to justify the reserve transfers. That way, you can show the membership, even if we are 100% funded today or 20% funded, this is the path moving forward in order to complete all of our projects moving forward and what's going to take the adjustments that we need to make to the budget to make it happen.
Yes.
So, Sean, did you want to cover three outcomes?
Sure, I'll go from here for a little bit. So the three outcomes are all going to be mapped out in the executive summary. So Sean touched on the component list, which is the building blocks of everything that goes forward in the reserve study. And then the second outcome is going to be percent funded, and that's the health of your reserve fund. And we do find that communities with healthy reserve funds are healthy communities. And then ultimately, then part three is going to be the funding plan. So the question is always, what components do we include in the component list? And I remember back when Sean and I were newbies in the reserve study world, there was this thought of, oh, it's all in a book, and these guys just follow a book, and there's never been a book. But there is National Reserve Study Standards. And National Reserve Study Standards gives us a three-part test. And the three-part test is going to guide us on what components that we're going to include in the reserve study. So the first part is it the association's obligation? Is it part of the common area? We're not going to fund for people's interior furniture, stuff like that. If it's not the association's obligation, we are not going to charge our ownership for it. Can it be reasonably anticipated? We're not going to include earthquake repairs because if Caltech can't predict it, we can't predict it. It's not reasonably anticipated. Significant cost. Now that's an important one. For most of you in Southern California or California entirely, that's going to be about $800 and above, right? But it's got to be a significant cost. And one thing I always try to drive home with this slide is if you're replacing the light bulbs in your community, that's going to be an operating expense. But if you're replacing your light poles, that's a reserve expense. And so what that's going to do is that's going to filter out indeterminate projects that are going to be life of the building, small little projects. It's going to take out capital improvements, and we'll talk a little bit more about capital improvements coming up. And what that means then is that for most of us in California, our component list is going to be 25 to 50 components. So it's not giant. So about 25, 50 components is really kind of the norm there. So I want to touch again on capital improvement. So this is a big concern that a lot of people have. And how do you find that? How do you find that line of what is a capital improvement versus a reserve component? And I'm gonna suggest we always fall back to that three-part test. And the first one is is it the association's responsibility? If it doesn't currently exist, it is not yet the association's obligation. So you can't use reserve funds for it. So like in this slide, we're seeing this nice lake, and this community wanted to have a beautiful dock, and it was not developed by the developer. It was something that the board wanted. So they had to special assess to get that. They had to find a way to fund for it outside of reserves because remember that reserves are there because the reserve funds have been sent to offset the ongoing deterioration of the current assets. If we take funds away from those in order to fund for something that's new, we're going to harm the percent funded or the funding strength for our assets that currently exist. So we want to avoid doing that. Now, the caveat we're going to add there is that if it's a natural upgrade, it's okay to use reserves. So if you're going from incandescent lights to LED lights, that's a natural upgrade. I talk about if you're remodeling a clubhouse and you're going from a tube TV to a large flat screen TV, that's a natural upgrade. So natural upgrades are okay, and so their reserves are for repairs and replacements, but not new additions, but natural upgrades are okay. And that's our talking point. I really kind of want our audience to go home with that when that comes up, hey, this is what reserves are for. Natural upgrades are okay.
And Sean, you gave a really important piece of advice there that when you are considering proceeding with a true capital improvement, adding a new amenity to the community and so forth, that the special assessment is very necessary because what that does is naturally through a special assessment, you've verified owner approval and obtained that.
Yep.
And moving forward, once the new amenity is constructed and installed, from that point on, then we can add it to the reserve study because then it becomes a common area maintenance responsibility that was approved by the membership. But if a board is ever uncertain on how to proceed, if it is a natural upgrade or a capital improvement, at that point, I highly recommend that you talk to your attorney because
Yes.
you don't want to misstep and you don't want to proceed spending tens of thousands of dollars that you're now realizing that you really should weren't allowed to do that.
Yeah, totally agree. Now, one of the things that does come up is what if a component is missing? What if I mean, Sean and I would never have this happen, but what if we missed a pool heater, right? Where does the money come from? Can I spend reserve funds on it? The first thing I'm going to encourage you to do is to look deeper in the report. Maybe it's grouped, it's under pool equipment or something like that. Refer to your three-part test. If it passes that three-part test, it should be included. It should be funded for. So if your reserve analyst misses your pool heater, that is a classic reserve component and it passes all three parts of the three-part test. Do the project, spend the money, add it to the next reserve study. Email, call your reserve analyst and say, hey, I think you missed this. We've replaced our pool heater. Here's the cost. Please make sure it's in the reserve study going forward. And then the question is always, would it cost more or less? Now, the first thing I'm going to say is to perform the project. If it costs more or less, it doesn't matter. If the project needs to be done, if the roof costs more than the reserve study said, you still got to replace the roof. So perform the project. Expect extra or unused funds to be reallocated because remember we use the pooling fund method for funding. And then again, go ahead and update the reserve study with the new useful life and remaining life expectations. Now, typically 60 to 80% of reserve contributions are driven by just a few components, and everybody always everybody thinks for some reason they always jump in and say it's 7 or 10. The interesting thing is 5 components generally drive every reserve study. And so we want to be thinking dominant components. And dominant components are usually roofing, painting, asphalt, decking here in California now, but also major mechanical, interior renovations, and recreational components. So like large tot lots, stuff like that. So those are the components. If you're going through your reserve study, make sure you're look at those components. Make sure that you agree with them. Or if you don't agree with them, reach out to your reserve analyst. Say, hey, I've noticed that you're recommending this for this component. Can you please explain that to me? So ultimately, what those components do, those do shift your reserve contribution and your percent funded. your pool pump isn't going to change anything. You can extend the life out 30 years on your pool pump. It's not going to move the needle at all. But roofing and painting certainly will. And we'll demonstrate that right now. So remember that we don't want to be thinking about the largest components. We want to think dominant components and cost per year. So if we have a $100,000 component and a $50,000 component, human nature tells us that we should really focus on that $100,000 component because it's a big number, right? But the $50,000 component is actually going to affect the reserve funds more because that's a painting project that gets done every 5 years versus a roofing project that gets done every 20 years. So it's going to hit reserves very differently. It's the roofing project's going to be just $5,000 a year because it's got a much longer life versus the painting project that's done every 5 years, it's going to hit at $10,000 a year. So that $50,000 project is actually twice as expensive for the community as the roofing project.
And Sean, that was a great slide. And as board members, when you identify those significant projects, I would we would highly recommend that you dedicate the most time and effort into preventive maintenance schedules. That's where annual roof maintenance, for example, can extend the life of a roof maybe 5, 10 years. And
Yes.
that's actually usually maintenance is handled. Roofing maintenance is a classic operating expense for a lot of communities. So that's where some operating line items support the reserves. Or, if you have a lot of exterior siding, sticking to that 5-year repaint schedule can drastically extend the remaining life of the siding replacement. So you have one line item on your reserve study supporting this another line item. And if you can find competitive proposals, shaving that $10,000 per year painting project down to $9,000 per year, that's going to have a very drastic, important, not drastic necessarily, but a very important, noticeable difference on your reserve funding plan moving forward, as opposed to just getting, an extra year on a roof or something like that. So if you can prioritize which projects to get the best competitive proposals for, that will be a very good service for your members at large as far as keeping costs as low as possible.
Yeah, I agree. And remember that it costs ten times more to replace something prematurely than to maintain it. So we want to make sure that we're doing our preventive maintenance.
Exactly.
Sean, you want to talk about the fully
Yeah.
funded balance?
So the fully funded balance, this is we're really getting into, the reserve study universe. This is just daily fun for Sean and I, but for you as board members and managers, I know this causes a lot of confusion because this is the most one of the most important figures you're gonna get from your reserve study. Um, Certainly the percent funded may be the most important, but it's based on this figure. So it's important to understand the calculation. We're often asked, oh, the fully funded balance, that represents how much it would cost to replace everything today, right? The answer is no. This is a calculation that sums up your current deterioration value, meaning if a project has any remaining life on it, a year or 29 years left on it, we're going to calculate how much should be saved today, not the full project cost because that's not needed at this time. So for every single line item, this formula is applied to them individually. The current age divided by useful life multiplied by current costs, and we come up with the fully funded balance figure for that individual project, and then we tally all of those up together to come to the grand total. And we'll illustrate, the importance of this calculation. So we have a really simple example here. Pool furniture, a 5-year project with a zero remaining life, a cost of $4,600. Today, you should have $4,600 because that project is currently due. So you need the funds now. You're out of time. But say you have a 10-year project with 5 years remaining on that life and a current cost of $10,000. Today, you should have $5,000 of that project saved. Half of its value because we are at the halfway point of its life cycle. And if this was magically the only reserve component on your reserve study, and you were showing us this, you would be 100% funded. It doesn't mean that you are finished with the funding plan. You still have 5 years to come up with the rest of the project cost. It just means that you are on the perfect funding pace so that when this project does come due, the funds are now established in your reserves, ready to go if needed. So, the percent funded calculation, this is like your credit card score or your cholesterol reading on your physical exam. This is a very important indication of health when it comes to your community, because oftentimes we're asked, well, how much should we have in reserves? Where they want a dollar amount, 500,000, 1 million. There's really no way to tell based on your cash balance. And this is why percent funded is such a great and important calculation, because it really cuts to the core of really what's the truth behind the numbers. And we're going to divide your reserve fund balance, what the cash that you have in reserves, and we're going to divide it by the fully funded balance to arrive at your current percent funded. So that grand figure overall, it's usually, there are some rare instances. I have come across a reserve component list where all 50 projects were due or overdue for completion. So yes, their fully funded balance did match the total replacement value, but in most cases, it's a much lower figure. And why is percent funded so important? And why do we, as your reserve study provider, encourage and recommend that you aim for full funding? Is that it enables you to keep up with the value of deterioration. It ensures that when every project is due, regardless of its remaining life, that it can be captured by a stable reserve transfer, your monthly budgeted transfer. And the stronger your reserves, the higher your percent funded is, 70% or higher, the better chance you have of avoiding any cash flow deficiencies and avoiding special assessments, which cause a lot of heartache for any community. And so this graph, you can see what it really boils down to. And your percent funded is going to show you how high risk you are for special assessments to come. So we consider reserves that are below 30% funded to be very weak. And you can see why in plain view, the red bars here. Year to year, you are facing an extremely high risk of special assessments, being less than 30% funded. Reserves that are 30 to 70% funded are considered to be in a strong range. You're facing a moderate risk of special assessment. And if you can get to 70% funded or higher, that is a strong reserve position, even though you're not 100% funded necessarily. If you're 70 or 71% funded, we still consider that to be pretty strong, healthy reserves, because what you're seeing here, very low risk of special assessments. And we come across a lot of communities that are starting from a low point, 10 or 20% funded. It's going to be a gradual process to build up strength, but the goal is every year to get better, to reduce this risk. You can see that by going from 30 to 40% funded cuts your risk of special assessment in half. So we're going to craft a funding plan to, number one, primarily for your near-term projects. We're going to have to tackle how to come up with the funding for that. And then once you establish a foundation, you get up into the 40, 50% range, then we can gradually build up strength from there. So what do percent funded what does that reveal aside from special assessments? You can make a strong argument that deferred maintenance is just as important on this list, maybe number one. What
Yeah.
deferred maintenance means is that because you didn't have the funds to repaint the wood siding or to replace the roof on schedule, that nothing can be accomplished and it's exposed to the elements. So if the wood is left unprotected, the weather elements are going to rot it, are going to warp it, allow water intrusion. If your roof is leaking and you can do nothing about it except to react to leaks as they spring up, now you're dealing with potential, building interior remediation projects, unit remediation. These are all what deferred maintenance does. I wish that every project on your reserve component list remains static as far as the cost, and you can buy more time to save for it. Unfortunately, that can backfire in many cases because then it opens the door to a whole new realm of much bigger expenses that were preventable. And that's a big point of your reserve schedule is to prevent bigger expenses that can be avoided. So when we're talking about affordability, we want to definitely avoid that. But another classic example is not waterproofing a balcony deck for, $2,000, $3,000. It leaks, it rots the structural joist, and now you have a $25,000, $35,000 project, spring up on to you. So yeah, higher net costs. Your project costs will not remain static for the most part. They're going to increase. It does have an impact on home values. New buyers can see the wear and tear throughout the community. And we can show you some classic examples and real world costs. That's a very big expense to lose on your home value, as well as also increase board liability. Imagine a scenario if everyone relies on one elevator system and it's allowed to fail and it's down for many months because the board is trying to pass a special assessment. If you have a resident who takes a spill in the meanwhile down the stairs with their groceries, this can create a new liability for the board that should be avoided. So what it really does, the lower your percent funded and the lower your reserve contributions are, the actual real world costs only become much more expensive and living at the community and the liabilities become all the more riskier.
Yeah, and paradoxically, Sean, one of the things that I found is that communities that have very low percent funded, it's usually because boards in the past have said they wanted to keep dues low. The problem is then they're just plugging holes along the way. And so paradoxically, the goal was to keep dues low, and they end up having much higher dues because everything's a crisis. So they're paying more money for things. They're paying things to be done more quickly. Like we started the discussion with when to start your reserve study. If you're starting a reserve study now, you're going to have a pretty affordable reserve study to get done. If you started in October and need a 1 week turnaround, it's going to get really expensive. So one of the things that I try to tell my clients is, hey, the better planning is going to save you a lot of money long term. And that's ultimately what we do with reserve studies is planning for these things. So let's talk about the funding plan a little bit. So we've got the three different aspects here. We've got the component list. We've built the foundation for the reserve study. We've figured out the reserve fund strength. Now we want to figure out the funding plan. And the funding plan that we recommend is full funding. And that's setting a reserve funding goal to attain and maintain reserves at or near 100% funded. Now, the caveat I'm going to add to this is notice it doesn't say next year. It doesn't say you have to get there next year. And so for everybody who's saying, oh, we can never get to 100% funded, remember that the reserve study is a 30-year document. It is very regular that I'm setting a goal to get to 100% funded in 29 years. So it's not impossible. It's very possible, very reasonable to get there. And ultimately, what reserve contributions are for is to offset the ongoing deterioration of the assets. The cost of deterioration is a bill like any other bill in your community, and you need to think of it that way. You pay the electric bill, you need to pay the deterioration bill, and the deterioration bill is your reserve contribution. So the cost of deterioration is pretty easy. One of the things, Paige started the presentation with discussing, it's not a lot of math or complicated math, and she's right that it's not complicated math. There is a lot of math, but it's pretty simple math, but it's pretty important math. So like when we look at this, if we want to figure out the cost of deterioration, we look at this pool resurface and it's got a useful life of 10. And if we divide the cost to resurface the pool, which is $10,000 by 10 by its useful life, we know that that pool is deteriorating at a rate of $1,000 a year. And we do that for each component. So the asphalt ceiling is also deteriorating at $1,000 a year. So we want to make sure that we're tracking that. And what that's going to do is that's going to set our baseline. That's going to let us know how our contribution is keeping up. So for this community, their baseline is $20,170. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that our contribution rate is at or above that, because I'll show you what happens. So if we have a stable contribution rate, and that's just at the rate of deterioration, and we're at 58% funded, if you notice, we constantly sit through being about 58% funded. Now, if we were at 100% funded, that would be wonderful. We could just take the rate of deterioration, plug it in, say, we'll do inflationary increases going forward, but the minority of our clients are 100% funded. So oftentimes what we're saying is you need to have your contribution rate above the rate of deterioration. And so that tells me, like with this community being 55% funded, they need to step on the gas. They need to get above that rate of deterioration. And if you notice, Sean talked earlier about that 70% funded level. This community, the vast majority of the next 30 years, even though they're not 100% funded, is above 70%. So they've only got a 1% chance of special assessment. That's a great position to be in. But oftentimes people make the bad decision of keeping dues artificially low, and usually that's at the expense of they don't want to fund reserves. So they have a reserve contribution that's less than the rate of deterioration. And as you can see, that same community that's about 55% funded, they spend about half their time at a high risk of special assessment. They're below 30% funded. So we really want to avoid that situation. So I always say that the rate of deterioration is one of the least noticed numbers in the reserve study, and it's one of the most important. So please make sure you're looking at that. And also on the full funding illustration, if you notice this community, this one was 81% funded, and we don't get them to 100% funded for 25 years. So again, it goes back to my point of we're not getting there tomorrow. This is a 30-year process. We want to get there over that 30 years. So the $1 million question is, what about inflation? And so obviously, Sean and my job has gotten a lot more complicated over the last 6 years because of the incredible inflation we've seen. And the incredible inflation we've seen caused us to really say, hey, how is this affecting reserve funding? So we have a statistician up in our Washington office who took a sample and looked at the effects that inflation was having on reserve funding, and he found that every additional point of inflation increases reserve funding by just over 22%. So that's incredible. And that's why all of us are experiencing that dues are escalating a lot faster than that 3% that the government tells us is CPI. It's far exceeding that 3%. And this is just showing you the sample that our statistician used. And then, unfortunately, interest is not offsetting inflation. So that same statistician ran the numbers for the same communities, and he found that every additional point of interest drops reserve funding by about 6.6%, but still we're at about 14% increase. So it's still a really big increase. I'm glad we're starting to get interest on our money. I remember back in the bad old days of 2008 to about 2019 where we just didn't get any interest on our money, but it's not offsetting the inflation that we've been seeing. And that's because inflation works on the entire cost of the project, while the interest only works on cash on hands actually on deposit. So the way we're going to prepare for this is we're going to make adequate reserve contributions. Make sure it's keeping up with deterioration. We want to make sure we're not keeping reserve contributions artificially low. We want to revisit and update the reserve study annually. Make sure you're looking at it. Make sure everything's captured properly. Listen to your trusted advisors. Talk to your reserve analyst. Find out why they're recommending what they're recommending. Talk to the guys who do your balcony inspections. Figure out what they're recommending. It'll make sure that your future is a very well planned and fruitful event. So, and then why do we prepare? We prepare because deterioration is real, and in accounting terms, depreciation is an expense to be offset. So deterioration versus depreciation, they can be used interchangeably. And offset it and spread it out. So our top five reserve study objections. We can't afford an increase. Owners will be angry. We can't ignore the real and predictable expenses that are coming at us. We need to plan now for an effective approach, and we need to be transparent with our owners. We'd rather keep our money and personally invest it, but it's the association's money. And as board members, you are there to make decisions that are in the best interest of the association, not you personally. Reserve studies are too conservative. Reserve studies are conservative, but as we've seen again over the last 6 years, we can see some pretty wild swings in costs. So it's good to keep things updated, make sure we're using live data. And then this is one of my favorites is we'll be long gone in 20 years. Uh, but your share of the ongoing deterioration is the responsibility of every owner in the community. Doesn't matter if you're not going to live there in 20 years. You're using that roof that's deteriorating right now. You're using the pool that's deteriorating right now. You need to pay your fair share of that deterioration rate. And then we don't do it this way. We special assess as needed. I hear that a lot, and I think in my 27 years of being at Association Reserves, I've come across one community that successfully did that, and it was an extremely high wealth community of about 5 units, and they were all friends, and they just figured out, oh yeah, we can come up with $20,000 at the drop of a hat, no big deal. Otherwise, it's a terrible idea to plan that way because nobody votes to tax themselves. Special assessments are very hard to get passed. And I always say, no politician has ever run on, I'm going to tax you. They always run on, they're going to tax somebody else. A special assessment is, hey, tax me. And so very few voters are going to do that. So it's a bad way to choose to run the association. So let's talk really quick about funding for a $250,000 roof. As you can see, if we fund with regular contributions and get interest on our money, then for that $250,000 roof, we are personally only paying $231,823 for it. So that's a win, right? If we get that special assessment, we're spending $250,000 for it. But if we take out a loan, we're paying almost $90,000 more for that roof. So sometimes loans are absolutely necessary. And there are a lot of my communities that they just have to do it and it's the right thing to do. But if you could avoid it, it's a very expensive tool in your toolbox. So try to keep it in your toolbox unless you absolutely have to.
And Sean, I really love this slide because it just lays out your options and what's going to be the most affordable. The budgeted contributions in this slide, this is a 15-year roof cycle. I believe the interest assumption was only 1% in this example. So, saving $18,000 roughly over 15 years might not be very exciting to pronounce to the community. But think about the savings overall. If you extrapolate the savings over all 50-year projects, now you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings over, a generation, which is an opportunity that should not be passed up. And the special assessment looks fair, it's on the bullseye. But as Sean said, we never see a community tax itself. Usually there's years of deferred maintenance and unnecessary repairs and bigger problems that occur because the roof was leaking for 5, 10 years and now you have structural problems. And then they
Right.
pass the special assessment. And all those little band-aids that were done to the roof over the years, they all get and ripped off, and the new roof has to go in all the same. But it's like if you just moved into this community and only used that roof for 3 months, you're getting hit with the special assessment where the prior owner used the roof for 14 years plus and didn't pay a dime towards it. It's like buying a used car and finding out that you need to pay for the prior owner's payments. And, paying $90,000 more almost for the same exact roof is never a good plan. And, to get a loan, you have to have reserves. And oftentimes that becomes the collateral. You have to maintain a minimum balance with the bank. So it all just backfires, The cheapest, most affordable method is the adequate, responsibly planned reserve transfers.
Yeah, yeah, loans are expensive. We're not certain you'll qualify.
Yeah.
Qualification and funding takes valuable time away from boards and management. You then have injected banker oversight onto your budget, and it just complicates sales and transactions.
Yeah.
So
Paying a higher interest rate because you had weak reserves, weak collateral.
yeah, so it's always best to make adequate funding, and the best practices are always you fund reserves through regular contributions, like Sean said. It's going to save you money long term. We want to be proactive and not reactive in maintenance and common elements. It's really important. The common area maintenance and preventive maintenance is going to save you so much money long term. No basic construction red flags. You know, Sean caught that slide earlier about Robert looking at some asphalt that was having alligator cracking prematurely. Know why that's a problem. Know why asphalt tells you when it's deteriorating. So do roofs. So does paint. So knowing those red flags will help you make really good decisions going forward.
Yeah. Look for water stains on the bottom of your balcony decks or the ceiling of your parking garage if it's above a courtyard. Those are very important red flags.
Yes, absolutely. And then with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to Paige for questions.
All right. Thank you, Sean and Sean. Yes, let's dive into the Q&A. First question, what advice do you give to associations who want to use reserve funds for a capital improvement? Would you modify a reserve study to include the improvement in the reserve study so boards can use the funds for the improvement?
No, I wouldn't. I would tell them, number one, talk to your attorney. Number two, if it doesn't currently exist, it doesn't belong in reserves. Once it does exist, if you add that doc, then I will fund for it once it's there, but I will not add a component that does not yet exist.
All right, along the same lines, to clarify, you should not borrow from reserves to pay an unexpected HOA operating expense, even if it is paid back to reserves.
You can, absolutely. But best case scenario is you don't. But as you correctly point out, you have 365 days to pay it back. You have to notify the ownership. And sometimes, and a lot of us in California are experiencing the necessity of doing that, especially with insurance costs. So yes, it's certainly legal as long as you do the notification and you pay it back. Best case scenario is you don't have to do that.
All right. With the upcoming state requirements for ornamental lawns, would the cost for any required conversions come from the reserves, or would that be a new expense that requires a special assessment?
That very good question. First of all, it has to be common area that we're talking about, and if so, that is something to definitely discuss with your reserve specialist and start the funding as sooner rather than later. Or since it is a relatively short window of conversions over to the non-functional turf issue. A special assessment may be needed, but it is a project that is, if it's community responsibility, and now we definitely have a predictable remaining life, that you should try to work with your reserve specialist to see how we can absorb this big project that is, due to legislation, not normal life cycles.
Yeah, yeah, agree with everything there, and just try to get it in your reserve study sooner than later. Perhaps do a phased project, figure out how you're going to do it. I have been including them in our reserve studies.
Okay. If the board elects to materially deviate from the roof replacement timing assumed in the reserve study, what due diligence or professional evaluation would typically be recommended to support revising the remaining useful life assumptions for the roofs?
The board should only be extending lives, especially for an important project like the roof, based on professional roofing inspection, getting in where they're actually doing not just a visual inspection, which is the limits of our inspection is visual, but doing moisture tests, opening up parts of the roof to do a thorough investigation, and based on that opinion, or say the opinion of your elevator company, that's when important projects should be extended. But if there's no evidence of to justify that, and especially if you're having a lot of leaks, That's not something the board should be, taking responsibility over by arbitrarily pushing back important projects.
Yep.
All right. Estimated costs for repairs seem very high. We usually find that true cost of a repair is less than the numbers included in the study. It seems that the result is that we are more at risk or lower on the scale of funding, so we look less well funded. Is that possible to change?
If you have actual costs, I would present that to your reserve analyst. That we so we in our office track costs by zip code, and so that we are hopefully in the ballpark. If you're finding that your reserve analyst is funding, it's not that's not an objection I often hear. By the way, I often hear that the costs in the reserve study are too low. So if you feel that they're too high, and you can get a vendor to let you know, and this happens quite regularly, where boards will present us with, hey, these are three actual bids for replacing that roof, then we would just include that in the reserve study with those costs.
And sometimes we catch important details. The board will get this very low proposal thinking it's a comprehensive replacement. But if you look at the details, they're actually adding another layer to the existing roof. So that's not what we were targeting. We were targeting full replacement with a 15, 20-year life where the overlay is much cheaper, but will get half that life. And so sometimes the boards will look at that low bid, not realizing it's actually for kind of like an extension but it's not a full replacement.
Yeah.
Can you speak to reserves that are overfunded, 120% plus? I typically see this as a red flag that components are not being maintained.
No, that could be a great sign that they were really on top of the funding plan. Maybe some prior life cycles lasted naturally longer and the reserves strengthened. But remember, if the project is still due 10, 15 years from now, that's based on its current deterioration value. It means that they're funding at they've been funding at a really good pace, and they should have very stable funding moving forward, very small increases to keep up with that deterioration. But if the project is not completed, if it's running beyond, if they are truly 120% funded but are now ignoring projects because they're afraid to spend reserves, that's an issue. But if not, if the projects truly do have remaining lives on them, then it just means that they are in a good position to win an important race.
Yeah, and I would say just the last little exclamation point I'll put on that is if they're 120% funded and they're doing the projects they should be doing, that's one of the rare times where you could actually anticipate no increases in the reserve contribution and just allow inflation to bring you down to 100% funded. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it could be, as Sean said, there were some life cycles that they got more life out of it or something like that. But at that point, they're in the very good position of saying, hey, we're going to keep dues steady for 2 years, and that'll bring us down to 100% funded, and then let's do inflationary increases.
Yeah, and don't stop funding. That's a big
No.
mistake, which I've
Yeah.
seen.
Yeah. Never stop funding.
Perfect. That actually segues into this next question, which is a clarification one, but you just touched on it. Are you saying that being close to 100% means that inflation is less of an impact?
Yeah,
No.
yeah. I mean, you're able to, well, most of all, you're maximizing your interest return by having high optimal reserve levels. So the interest can't have make any sort of impact at all if you don't have reserves to garner it. So if you're close to 100% funded, you're going to maximize your returns, and that's the best way of reducing inflation. Aside from avoiding deferred maintenance, which is the whole, wild it's like a different type of inflation. It's new project expenses that were avoidable, so to speak. So, I mean, I know it's not inflation, but it's more extra costs. So yes, being 100% funded definitely is the most effective way to minimize the impact of inflation. And if we do have wild supply chain issues like we did a few years ago, your reserve fund is better positioned to navigate that situation the most.
All right. I'm concerned that Senate Bill 1007 passes. Reserve funding will be the first component of financial management and planning to be seriously compromised since this bill aims to severely limit the board to increase annual assessments. What is our industry doing to educate our lawmakers?
We have lots of people that are members of CLAC. Everybody shares your concern. So lots of people are going to legislative days. Lots of people are really working hard to make sure that doesn't pass because you're correct in that it would be a very negative event for our industry if that law passes.
All right, we are at time, so I will throw one last question out there. Thank you all for joining us and submitting such great questions. Last question here is, what are the procedures to borrow from reserves?
So you have to have work with your property manager, in some cases maybe an attorney, but there's a disclosure process. The community has to be made aware of the reason for the borrowing, and the plan to repay it. And then the next step is, yeah, follow that plan of repayment, because in the state of California, it should be repaid within 12 months. Sometimes you borrow from reserves because it's such a immediate need, and that then you can focus on the special assessment to repay it. But either way, within 12 months, it's such a short window. Whether you hike up assessments or if it's a special assessment, it's an extra assessment to repay. So use it if it's very justified, but follow procedures. Do not borrow without following being transparent and following those disclosure protocols.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sean and Sean. That concludes our webinar. If anyone is interested in a recorded version of this or any other webinar, you could search for them on YouTube or on the Association Reserves webinars page. If you enjoyed today's session and would like to receive the Association Reserves newsletter or announcements of future webinars, please visit www.reservestudy.com and click the icon at the bottom of the page to sign up for the newsletter. As a reminder, certificates of completion will be emailed out within 1 week. We will also email out a link to this recording and a copy of the slide deck. I want to thank you all for attending. If you have any questions or if there's any way we can be of service to you, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Thank you.